There is silence that is not just the absence of sound. It is pain, it is distance, it is a suppressed scream. Arthur lived surrounded by luxury, but without knowing how to reach his own son. A successful businessman, owner of a mansion without laughter. He lived with a pain that not all the money in the world could silence. Caio, his autistic and non-verbal son, had never uttered a single word, and this absence spoke too loudly. But everything began to change the day Arthur arrived home early from work and saw a scene that disconcerted him. It was nothing grand, just little Caio with a toy microphone in his hand, and next to him, Livia, the newly hired nanny, singing softly, unhurriedly, with an almost sacred calm. It seemed like a silent ritual, a bridge being built between two worlds that until then had seemed unreachable. This is not just a story about autism. It is a story about rediscovery, about music as a tool for love, about emotional routines that heal invisible wounds. It is about the everyday miracle of a bond that is born, even when everything seemed lost. And maybe, just maybe, you will realize that the true luxury of life is not in what you can buy, but in what you can feel. Arthur was the kind of man who learned to control everything, except his own heart. After suddenly losing his wife, the businessman threw himself into work, trying to fill the void with meetings and figures. But the real silence was inside the house. His son, Caio, autistic and nonverbal, grew up without a voice, without a tight hug, without his father present. The mansion where they lived was as cold as the hallways of a company at 3 in the morning. The days passed like replicas of each other. Arthur barely noticed the signs of tiredness, of absence, of frozen mourning that Caio expressed with his body, because there were no words. Communication between them was done through closed doors and distant footsteps. Autism in that home was an insurmountable wall. But what no one said, and perhaps not even he knew, is that that boy also suffered from not being seen right in front of his own father's eyes. This emotional distance grew worse with each failed attempt at contact. Arthur saw Caio as a problem to be managed, a living reminder of the pain of loss. The silence between them was unnatural. It was imposed by a lack of empathy, of listening, of true presence. But how can you build a bridge if you don't even acknowledge the abyss? It was at this exact point that the story needed a new chapter, and it would arrive in the most unexpected way. Livia didn't have any shiny diplomas or neurodevelopmental courses on her resume, but she did have something rare: sensitivity. From the first day in that house, she didn't try to force smiles or break the silence by force. She simply sat next to Caio on the living room rug and respected his time. Her look said more than any words. "I'm here, however you can receive me." That simple gesture, presence without demands, began to dissolve an old tension that hung in the air. Little by little, the environment began to change. There were no major revolutions, but small breaks in the rigidity of the routine. She began to hum softly as she organized the toys. She introduced gentle touches and slow smiles. She offered Caio not commands but invitations, and he, with the shyness of someone who had never had space to blossom, began to observe her. At first, it was just a glance, then a subtle gesture, like pushing a toy in her direction. It was the beginning of something beautiful. While Arthur continued to be immersed in his reports and meetings, Livia became the bridge between worlds. She did not fill the silence. She inhabited it. And, by doing so, she awakened in Caio the courage to trust, even without words. Perhaps it was the first time that someone saw that boy beyond his condition, and this perception, even silent, was already the beginning of a transformation. Because every great connection begins where there is space, and she knew how to create space with her heart. The first sound did not come as a word or a sentence. It came as a rhythmic sigh, almost imperceptible, while Livia strummed a colorful xylophone on the living room floor. It was as if something inside Caio had been ignited. The music, with its undemanding language, found a gap in that thick silence. And little by little, Between a toy drum and the tinkling of a bell, the boy began to make sounds. They were not speech, but responses. An everyday miracle was beginning to happen. Timid, but real. Livia realized the power of music as a form of non-verbal expression. Instead of insisting on conventional methods, she brought soft melodies into her routine. She created a small ritual. After snack, sounds would come: xylophone, tambourine, even a toy microphone that became a symbol of emotional freedom. And Caio, with his curious gaze, began to participate. First by observing, then by playing, and finally by risking loose vowels that sounded more like enchanted babbling. There was no rush, no goals, just a bond. The connection between them was in tune, like a song that needed no chorus. Arthur, from afar, began to realize that something was changing. The echoes of the music passed through the walls of the mansion and touched parts of him that had long been dormant. The silent, autistic boy was finally beginning to find his own way of singing to the world, and the world, surprisingly, was listening. The sound that came through the bedroom door that late afternoon wasn't loud, but it was impossible to ignore. Arthur was in his office, reviewing contracts, when he heard a child's voice, slow, out of tune, but sweet, playing along with a piece of music that came from a video on his tablet. He put down his pen. His heart, accustomed to the rhythm of profits and goals, slowed down, as if he were hearing a new language. For the first time, he recognized the melody coming from Caio, and it completely disarmed him. In the following days, the businessman began to show up at home earlier. Without any big announcements, without any theatrical attempts, he would just sit in the corner of the room and listen. He saw his son repeat sounds, imitate passages, clap his hands, and with that, he realized how much he had lost trying to be successful. Empathy, which had previously seemed like a distant luxury, became a vital necessity. The strict father was giving way to the broken man who wanted to rebuild not an empire, but a bond. Arthur's transformation wasn't instantaneous, but it was sincere. He traded business dinners for nursery rhymes. He learned to use his toy microphone, even if it was out of tune. He discovered that being present didn't mean solving everything, just being there. And ironically, the same silence that once symbolized distance now represented acceptance. Because sometimes the greatest sound a father can make is to shut up and listen to his own child's heart. Before the words came, the look. One of those that lasts half a second, but says everything. Livia knew how to interpret silences like few others. When Caio stared at her while she sang softly, she didn't need subtitles. There was a subtle request there. Keep going. I'm here. That silent exchange became the purest channel between them. No demands, no forcing interactions, just real empathy, translated into presence and attention. It was through his eyes that Caio began to truly communicate. One glance at the toy on the top of the shelf, another at the door, indicating that he wanted to leave, sometimes a quick blink, other times a deep stare, as if he were trying to speak to Livia's soul. And she, with rare patience, responded with gentle gestures, with her hand on his shoulder, with a calm wave. They created their own grammar, where affection was the main verb. While many still believed that communication had to come from the mouth, the opposite was proven. Nonverbal expression became the strongest bridge. Livia showed Caio that he could trust him, even without understanding all the social rules. And to her father, she showed that bonds are not imposed, they are built. A look can be a cry, a hug, a relief. And in that previously cold home, eyes began to say, I see you, and I am here. Livia knew that children, especially those with autism, feel safer within predictable routines. But she went beyond mechanical predictability. She created effective rituals. Nothing complex. After breakfast, the same instrumental music. Before bath time, a story told with exaggerated gestures and pauses full of intention. Caio began to anticipate these moments with attentive eyes and a slight swaying of his body, as if he were dancing with his own security. These small rituals did not require words, but they carried profound messages. You are important. I am here. Everything is fine. The gentle touch of his hair while he put on his pajamas, the two of them twirling in the late afternoon to the sound of a flute, the silence shared while reading. These gestures were repeated with love, not with rigidity, and that made all the difference. Kaio began to open up, slowly, like a flower sensitive to the sun after the rain. These moments began to shape the relationship between everyone in the house. Arthur, watching from afar, found himself drawn to that atmosphere of tenderness and calm. He began to participate in the rituals, first as a spectator, then as an apprentice. He realized that affection does not require spectacle, but consistency, and that creating a routine of connection does not imprison the other person, but rather liberates the bond. The house, which was once made of stone, now had rituals that made it a home. There was no warning, no background music, just a simple sound that cut through the air like a ray of sunlight piercing the fog. Pa. That's what Arthur heard as he walked down the hallway. Paralyzed, he thought it was all in his head. But when he looked into the living room, he saw his son with the toy microphone in his hand, and his mouth still half open, as if he were testing a new superpower. Livia, next to him, smiled without saying a word, because at that moment any noise would seem disrespectful to the miracle. Kaio had vocalized before, yes, but never a syllable that seemed so directed, so full of intention. It was as if, for the first time, he was trying to make himself heard. The emotion that invaded Arthur was overwhelming. The man who dealt with CEOs and million-dollar decisions was now crying on his knees on the living room carpet, in front of a short but deep sound. There he understood it wasn't about listening with his ears, it was about being touched with his soul. From that day on, moments spent with his son took on new meaning. Each new sound, each attempt, was celebrated as a giant victory. Fluency didn't matter. Intention mattered, and Arthur, who had previously sought control and results, learned to value the process. The silence still existed, but now it was full of life. And that sound, pa, became the greatest gift he had ever received in his entire life. Kaio never said, "I love you," with words, but one day he pushed a building block toward his father, with both hands firmly in his hands. It was just a blue cube, seemingly unimportant, but for Arthur it was a gesture full of affection, a symbolic gift, as if to say, "I trust you." And that's when his father realized, in his son's world, love manifests itself in small gestures but full of intention. After that, other signs began to appear. A brief smile when he entered the room, a long touch on the hand, a body swaying in sync when they listened to the same song together. Every action, no matter how small, was an emotional achievement. Arthur began to collect these moments like someone who keeps rare jewels, and he understood that, in the world of empathy and autism, what is symbolic is often worth more than any words. Livia called these everyday miracles, and she was right. For many people, giving a toy or smiling may seem trivial, but when it comes from someone who spent years in silence, it's a revolution. Kaio's language was made of presence and delicacy, and Arthur, previously blinded by numbers, now saw with his heart. He was learning that emotional bonds are not built in a hurry, but with patience, affection, and attention to small gestures. Arthur has always been driven by deadlines and goals. I knew how long it took for a project to generate profit, but I never stopped to think about how long it takes for love to blossom. With Kaio, he had to unlearn everything. He understood that it wasn't his son who lived outside of time, but he who was always racing against the clock. By accepting his son's pace, the father began to notice nuances that he had previously ignored. A long look, a pause full of meaning, a different breathing during a song. This reconstruction was not easy. There were days when Arthur felt useless, not knowing how to help. On other days, he was moved just by seeing his son rest his head on his shoulder. But it was during this process that he discovered the beauty of caring. He began to prepare breakfast, wash toys, and observe each small progress with the eyes of someone who is relearning how to live. The businessman gave way to the present father, not the perfect father, but the one who is there, whole, at the right time. By following Kaio's rhythm, Arthur also accessed his own grief. He cried for his wife, for her absences, for the time lost. But he didn't stay stuck in that. He chose to transform pain into care, silence into listening, and he discovered that unconditional love is not a feeling that appears suddenly, but a construction made of presence, respect, and continuous attention. And the more he walked alongside his son, the more he found his own path as a man and as a father. At first, the toy microphone was just another object among many forgotten objects at the bottom of the trunk. But for Kaio, it became a symbol of expression, and for Arthur, a portal. When his son held it and made sounds, even without melody or apparent logic, there was something sacred happening there. It was the beginning of a voice, not just literal, but emotional, a cry of presence, a note of affection, a call for true connection. Arthur started using the microphone too, sometimes out of tune, other times not knowing what to say, but always with an open heart. He invented silly rhymes, sang songs from his childhood, created sounds just to make his son laugh, and it worked. The microphone became a bridge between worlds, between the silence of pain and the joy of encounter. More than a toy, it was now an instrument of healing, of expression, of an everyday miracle. Together, they created a musical routine that didn't follow sheet music, but followed love. Sometimes it was Kaio who started a new sound. Sometimes it was Arthur who started a rhythm by banging his hands on the table. The format didn't matter. What mattered was affection. What had once been a painful silence was now singing, a song without lyrics, but full of presence, empathy, and transformation. The toy microphone had become the melody of their love. Livia never wanted the spotlight. From the beginning, she knew that her mission was to prepare the ground, not to reap the rewards. When she saw Arthur and Kaio connecting through the microphone, she understood that her role was being fulfilled. She didn't feel jealous or hurt by her protagonism. On the contrary, she smiled with all her heart. The nanny who had arrived as a caregiver now saw herself as a bridge. She had helped open the doors, but she knew that the journey was theirs. In silence, he began to withdraw from the moments when father and son interacted. He gave them space, without completely moving away. He watched from afar as the two of them built their own music, their own emotional rituals, and it was beautiful to see. Livia understood that empathy also means knowing when to back off. His presence remained there, firm, but more like a foundation than a roof. It was like someone who plants and trusts that the earth will know how to do the rest. By not placing herself at the center of the story, Livia taught another powerful lesson. True transformation happens when people take on their own roles. She didn't save Arthur or heal Kaio. She simply created space for the love between them to unfold. And sometimes that's exactly what's most beautiful, being remembered not for your constant presence, but for the change that you allowed to happen with delicacy, care, and silence. The mornings began to sound like life. Kaio would wake up and run to the toy microphone as if he were looking for a lucky charm. Arthur already knew what to do. He would make a simple coffee, play his usual music, the one they used to start the day, and wait for his son to sit down next to him. There was no elaborate conversation, no plan. There was presence, and that was enough. The ritual was silent, but it overflowed with emotional connection. It was an affectionate routine that was not written in any manual, but engraved in the hearts of both. Livia, now on the sidelines, watched the scene with teary eyes. She knew that those daily gestures were the true building blocks of the father-son relationship. With each song sung in duet, with each silence shared with tenderness, they built something solid, something that years before seemed impossible. And the most beautiful thing about it all was that there was no performance, no audience, just real connection. Love without subtitles, rediscovery in its purest form. The rituals that began with toys and children's songs evolved into moments of pure harmony. Sometimes Kaio would pull Arthur to dance. Sometimes it was the father who improvised a beat on the table to cheer up his son. It was as if the language of music had become the official language of that house. And even though words were still rare, what was there was deeper than any dialogue. It was everyday affection in its most sincere form. Livia knew her mission was coming to an end when Kaio, without being encouraged, pulled his father's hand and led him to the toy microphone. There was no show, no warning. It was just a simple moment, but full of meaning. They sang together with shy smiles, out of tune, but full of truth. At that moment, Arthur looked at Livia as if he finally understood everything. The nanny, who had been a bridge, a guide, and a source of affection, was now preparing to leave. The farewell was not sad, but sweet. Livia said goodbye with a silent hug, respecting Kaio's space, and he, for the first time, rested his face on her shoulder. A simple gesture, but one that said thank you in a language unique to them. Arthur, moved, promised to keep alive the routine, the rituals, and above all, the time spent together. He knew that his story with his son would not have been possible without that soft-spoken woman with a firm heart. The house, once cold and marked by mourning, was now filled with restrained laughter, babbling sounds, and a soundtrack made of love and overcoming. Livia was gone, but she left her mark in every corner, in every song, in every little miracle that was now part of Arthur and Kaio's routine. Because sometimes love is just that, knowing when to come in and also when to go out. And she left with the certainty that now that house had become a home. Love is not always revealed in words. Sometimes it manifests itself in the silence that welcomes, in the look that understands, in the toy pushed as a symbolic gift. The story of Arthur, Kaio, and Livia reminds us that true connection does not require haste or perfection. It requires presence. The other person's time will not always be the same as ours, and that's okay. Learning to respect this time is, in itself, an act of unconditional love. Maybe you're experiencing a similar silence. It could be with a child, a parent, or someone you love who feels distant. But what if, instead of trying to fix everything with words, you just listened, paid attention, be there, even if you didn't know what to do? After all, many bonds are built with small gestures, and the first step may be just being there. Now tell me, what was the moment in this story that touched you the most? Have you ever experienced something similar, or do you know someone who needs to hear this message? Share it in the comments, like the video, and send it to someone special. And of course, if you want to follow more stories that warm the heart and awaken the soul, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because sometimes all someone needs is a story like this.